Okay. Check. Will you talking to your mic real quick?
This is David Hollander reporting from Earth.
Okay.
It's been a while since I've been here. Things look relatively the same. The same people seem to be in power. They have different faces, but they're the same people. And I still have to close my eyes a lot so as not to take in these things that are happening around me all the time, everywhere.
That's great. Welcome to the 44th episode of the Animal Riot podcast, brought to you by Animal Riot Press, a literary press for books that matter. I'm Katie Rainey, filling in for Brian Birnbaum while he's taking some time off. It's the 44th episode and the last one of 2019, but this is a really special episode, not for those reasons, but because I get to sit down and chat with one of my favorite people in the whole world, David Hollander. David Hollander is the author of the novel L.I.E, a Young Lions Fiction Award nominee, and the forthcoming Anthropica, which is Animal Riot's second book due out September 1st, 2020. But before I get to his bio, here is an Animal Riot first, our first brought to you by. And this episode is brought to you by an ad for Anthropica.
Coming September 2020, from the author of L.I.E, a novel readers called terrible, depressing, unsatisfyingly ambiguous, and a book I ripped in two and threw in the garbage the minute I was finished. David Hollander brings you Anthropica. Critics are tepid, if not outright ambivalent. Some even feel that Hollander's latest wasted so much of their time. Why not waste more by taking to Goodreads and writing, "This book was very weird to me, and I have to say that I didn't understand any of it." Another accuses the author of atheism, or is just a super prude. I didn't appreciate the continuous use of foul language and sexual dialogue included in nearly every character's story. Such a tone might be best described as awestruck. For a book that has not even been published yet, and for an author whose motives are more than a little suspicious, this is the highest of possible praise. This September, one man's quest to publish a book you'll never read comes to an end. If you like stories about underdogs who find redemption, if you crave books with happy endings and compelling plots, if you like a book that you can curl up in front of the fire with, or a book that has something to teach you, Anthropica will be of no use to you. If you only read one book this fall, make sure Anthropica isn't it. Pre-orders now available at animalriotpress.com.
That's great every time. If you want to see the complete trailer, head over to animalriotpress.com and you can see the images and the trailer in all its majesty. And his work has appeared in McSweeney's, Conjunctions, Fence, Agni, Unsaid, the New York Times Magazine, and Best American Fantasy, among other reputable and disreputable publications. I had not read that part of your bio yet.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll take that out.
I like it.
Yeah? Okay.
He lives in the Hudson Valley with his adorable children and wife, and they dress up like Donald Trump sometimes and
Only
Bernie
once.
Sanders.
That was before we thought Trump had any chance of winning the election. That was for Halloween.
Yeah.
And I was Secret Service.
You were.
Yeah.
And the kids were Bernie Sanders and Donald
Trump, yeah.
Which is
that's
the
right.
scariest thing you can be for Halloween.
Yeah. That must have, right. Halloween was less than a month before the election.
Yep.
How do you like that?
spooky.
Yeah.
He teaches writing to writers who want to teach writing to other writers at Sarah Lawrence College. You may or may not be able to find out more about him at longlivetheauthor.com. Hi, David.
Hello, Katie.
So before we really get going here, I want to talk about how we first met because it's a really cute story.
It is?
It's not actually how we met, but it's how I found you in this world and why I even ended up going to Sarah Lawrence in the first place.
So this is going to be a story I don't know yet.
I think you have told you this story.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm sorry if this is like a story that's really meaningful to you, and I don't.
You don't remember.
And I don't remember.
I hope that's the case because that's our relationship.
Okay. Yeah. I there's a lot I don't remember, but go ahead. Tell me the story.
Well, so what is this, 8-9 years ago now?
It would have been,
When I first decided I was going to grad school, I applied to 6 schools and got into 5 of them. And one, I even got a full ride, which was exciting. But to make my decision, I decided to read one book by every current faculty member at every one of those schools. I'm such a Hermione in that way.
Yeah.
And I read L.I.E., and that made my decision that day. I remember I was in Arkansas sitting on my back porch. It was really hot in March because it's Arkansas, and finished L.I.E. and put it down, and I was like, I'm going to Sarah Lawrence. And also for Brian Morton's A Window Across the River.
Yeah.
That book also.
That is a
made
beautiful
my
book.
decision.
I really like Brian's books, but I do not remember that story. I'm sure I've been told that story. And that means you've probably read L.I.E. more recently than I have.
Maybe. I've read it again since then.
People reference it sometimes, and I really don't.
You don't
I'm
remember
not
what you
lying
wrote?
at all. I don't even remember the plot points that they're mentioning. Yeah, it's really very wispy in my memory. I more remember what was going on in my life when I was working on it and what I was thinking about and why I was writing it the way I was than I remember anything that's actually in it.
Well, why did you write it the way it was? What do you remember?
Well, I'm really glad you asked, because when that book came out, it, critically it did fairly well. Like more people liked it than disliked it. But the parts of it they seemed to like were the parts that I didn't think mattered very much. Like the good reviews were mostly about how it was a convincing and unusual portrait of suburban malaise, right? But for me, that was just the material that I had. And what I really wanted to write about was consciousness and selfhood and this feeling at that point that was really sometimes difficult for me to navigate, that I was not actually David Hollander, but that I was kind of floating above him, that I was like watching my life more than living my life. So all those like philosophical preoccupations, which, connected for me to things like Immanuel Kant and to literary theory and to Borges and to like these really headier things. All of that stuff was either ignored or pointed out as the book's failure.
Yeah.
Right? And so that was really, so I remember all of those influences, and I remember the book growing out of experiences I had as an undergrad and studying with Rick Moody, who sort of introduced me to the idea that fiction could be more than storytelling. So it was like all these really important thought patterns and influences, I think, were driving that book. And I remember what it felt like to work on it and to have conversations with my friend Michael Smith Welch about it. But I don't remember very well what's in the book.
Well, Sarah Lawrence unfortunately did not put me in your class my first year. I was very upset about it.
You had to wait.
I did.
Yes.
I had Brian Morton, which was a great class. I loved his novel class. One day we're going to get Brian Morton on the podcast, although he has said no a couple of times.
I think he's just trying to live off the fame of his Twitter career. He has
He's very good at Twitter.
He is very good at Twitter.
Which we'll get more into Twitter later on.
He'd be a great interview, actually. Yeah.
Well,
No,
Sarah Lawrence did not put me in your class, and I was very pissed off for a year. And then they assigned me a thesis advisor who did not care for my writing.
Right.
And, well, even before that, I got yelled at by a teacher who did not like my writing in their class. I've told you this story.
Do you want to say their names?
No, I can't say it on.
Good,
no, gotta.
Because if you said their names, then I might say something bad about them, and then I'd be in trouble.
Yeah. So we're gonna
I have
keep
to be
it.
very careful.
We're gonna keep. They no longer work there.
Okay.
So I'll say that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I was pretty much in like a crisis of selfhood by the time I reached your class. I had convinced myself that I was just garbage. and shit. And
yeah, well, that I remember the arc of your semester in my workshop really well, because there were a couple of early things that you wrote, like responses to little prompts I'd given and things, and they were really cool, and there was definitely potential there. But by the end of that semester, you were writing some stuff that I just thought was really on fire.
Yeah.
Just totally like blown away. I remember at one point writing in the margin of one of your manuscripts just something like, "Holy shit, Katie, how are you doing this?" It was just like one chilling phrase after another. You know, it was like reading Cormac McCarthy or something. So how anyone could have been looking at your stuff and not have seen enormous talent is sort of beyond me, because that's the part you get good at spotting is talent. You become less good at knowing who will actually like publish soon.
Yeah.
Because your predictions about that can be wrong, but you definitely can see who has the raw talent.
Well, I went like halfway through that semester in your class. I had started my thesis, and I remember in the morning I had a meeting with my thesis advisor, and then I had like a half-hour break, and then I had conference with you.
Yeah.
And my meeting with my thesis advisor could not have been like more disheartening.
Yeah.
In which she said, you know, the thing about time is that we can only move forward. And I just like felt so gutted by that comment.
There
I
goes
was like,
Faulkner.
I know. I just felt so gutted by that. And then I took a break, and I was like reading a book, and then I walked over to conference, and you told me it was the complete opposite.
Right. Yeah.
And that like,
Well, the thing about it is I'm always right. I don't have a lot of confidence. I'm not confident about very many things, but I do feel like I'm always right when it comes to gauging student work and talent. And I think that a lot of writing teachers have this problem where no matter what they say, they're really looking for the same kind of product they would churn out.
Yeah.
You know, and when they don't see that, they feel like the student is somehow failing. And also, I think very few writing teachers think, especially fiction writing teachers, think about language. And so sometimes, I mean, there have been people who I've wanted to get admitted into our MFA program who have not gotten in. And that's because the package maybe they've submitted to us, the stories aren't very well put together, right? There isn't like a strong sense of, you know, the Chekhovian plot arc or whatever, right? But for me, if I see like 3 good sentences back to back, I'm like, yeah, they're in. Because that's talent, you know, and it can be molded in whatever direction that person ends up needing to be molded in. But yeah, I don't think a lot of people read that way.
Well, that's a really good segue into like the way you write and what you teach. And the way you teach, because it is like so completely different. I'd never had a class like yours, and it was like what I had been looking for and didn't realize.
You should talk to the tenure board.
I know.
In my college.
I know. I could sell. I could.
Yeah.
Just hire me as your lawyer in that situation. Can you
idea.
have a lawyer? Can we call?
That would be great if I could just sit there silently and say, I would like to defer this question to my lawyer.
I would be great at it.
Yeah.
Well, so it really has a lot to do with the structure too, and just like the way you talk about writing. What are those? I'm not going to say like 4 things. I don't know if you've changed it since then, but.
Oh, the way.
You talk about stories. You don't talk in terms of like character.
No, it's true.
Plot.
Well, what happened was that's connected to this course that I had started teaching to undergrads right around the same time you were in my graduate workshop, a course that I call The Enemies of Fiction. And, you know, I was thinking about the John Hawkes quote about he began writing with the belief that plot, character, setting, and theme were the enemies of the novel.
You introduced me to John Hawkes. And
oh, yeah.
The Lime Twig's my favorite book.
Oh, my God. That book is just so fucking good.
Yeah.
But
I almost
most people hate that book. You know, I tried to. I was in a. Here are some scare quotes.
Square quotes. No, square quotes.
Yeah, one of us will be able to speak. But I was in a book club with these 2 other writer friends, and I got to pick the first book, and I picked The Lime Twig by John Hawkes. And my friend Eduardo, who's a great writer, great novelist, he reported to the third person in the book club, I can't believe David gave us this book. This book is fucking unreadable, right? So not everyone loves John Hawkes, right? But the people who love him really love him, which goes back to teaching, you know, like you have to remember that just because you're not the reader for something doesn't mean those readers don't exist. But that course, The Enemies of Fiction, tried to replace those 4 categories, plot, character, setting, and theme, which Hawkes had imagined as his enemies, with 4 other categories that I was just trying to figure out, what is it that I value in fiction? What am I looking for if I'm not really looking for that, for like the clean plot arc and resolution and all that nonsense? And so those categories were language, structure, voice, and ideas or concepts, right? And so I started organizing my classes around those like 4 dividers. And I still do that, although I don't always say that I'm doing that, but that's usually what I'm thinking when I sort of figure out reading lists, but it changes.
I totally stole that from you and used that in my high school curriculum.
Oh, that's great.
It's a great way to teach teenagers.
I do it with my middle school kids. I teach, who you know them. Remember?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Those kids you taught before I taught them.
Oh, yeah, up in Cold Spring. They're cute kids.
Yeah.
Well, John Hawkes, so in your class at the end of the semester, we're supposed to bring in like a master piece or like something you want to share.
To read out loud. Yes, yeah.
And I remember I read the greatest paragraph that's ever been written, which is from the Lime Twig, which is talking about this man beating this woman.
Oh, yes.
But it's the most beautiful paragraph I've ever written. It's horrifying.
Yes.
And I wish I had it in front of me, I would read it. But it's talking about the strip of fat across her stomach and like a sound like a dead bird falling into a field. And
I know that section very well. Yeah.
And I read it with in such like a religious fervor in class.
Yes.
That when I looked up, everybody was like,
it's like crickets.
And you were like almost laughing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. At the distance between your experience and the reaction. Or
it was a really great moment. I will never forget that in your class.
Yeah. Was Brian in that class?
Brian Birnbaum?
Yeah. Mm-mm. No. Okay.
He's a year behind me.
Okay.
Yeah, I did not meet him until I graduated, actually.
Yeah.
And I didn't like Brian Birnbaum when I first met him.
I don't think anyone liked him.
Well, I didn't like him because you liked him.
Ah, yes. Yeah.
And you had mentioned him a few times in conference with me, and I'm like, who is this fucking kid?
Yeah.
Who's coming in on my territory?
Well, Brian Birnbaum had come and visited my class when he was trying to decide whether or not to enroll. And so I knew him. Actually, for a visitor to a class, I wish he were here because he was super rude. Like he, like I remember him like chewing gum the whole time. Like I've never really wanted to tell anyone to spit out their gum except for that one day where I was like, I don't even. But then afterward, he wrote me we had some long email exchanges where, he was trying to make a good decision about where to go, and I was telling him honestly, like, well, there are some things about this program that that might not be a good fit. And I think he appreciated the fact that I wasn't trying to like sell the school to him. You know? I was like, I have no reason to try to sell it to you. This is what it is. And I said, if you come here, you get to study with me, and that could be really good. So, yeah.
Well, you liked him enough to mention him in my time with you.
Sorry, Katie.
And so I
do that all the time, though. I talk about one student with another student. Yeah.
Well, I didn't like him, and then we met, and within like 2 seconds of us meeting, I was like, all right, I see why David likes him.
Yeah.
And we had like a really good conversation on like DFW.
Both of you guys sort of cut through a lot of, bullshit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a lot of bullshit. So.
Well, speaking of like Infinite Jest and DFW, I mean, like, do you consider yourself like a postmodernist? What is postmodernism anyways anymore? And like, do you consider yourself talking about these different, like the way you look at writing?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that the label helps anyone understand what anyone else's work is like. Yeah. But I know when I was, in my mid-20s and reading like a lot of the American postmodernists, Robert Coover and Donald Barthelme and Angela Carter, although she's not American. But I was discovering this thing that I didn't know until then fiction could do or was allowed to do, because a lot of the stories I was falling in love with were sort of fractured, and they were shattering the idea that fiction should resemble reality. They were shattering the idea that fiction should be earnest or reverent in any way. And in some ways, the way it actually feels to me to be alive and in the world was captured better by those crazy postmodern texts than by well-behaved books with well-worked out plots and endings. So something was going on for me when I discovered what people call postmodernism that was really important. But what I thought Wallace was trying to do, and this probably is close to my objective with Anthropica, is I thought he was trying to use some of those postmodern methods, fracture and play, disjointedness, sort of delayed gratification, right? I thought he was using some of these techniques. Technique sounds wrong, sounds too cold. Some of what he loved about postmodernism was certainly informing a book like Infinite Jest, but it was also a book that had a heart, right? And I thought he was trying to figure out a way to take what he'd loved about postmodernism and kind of marry it to what he loved about modernism. And I've heard it described. There's a critic, Stephen something.
Oh, I know who you're talking about.
He wrote a book about Franzen, actually.
Yeah.
But he mentions Wallace in passing. But anyway, he was trying to define this idea of postmodernism, which, it's a lot of syllables. But, as this idea of sort of bringing matters of the heart and real human concern and compassion into the sort of formal matrix of postmodern writing. And that, that is what I'm trying to do. It's weird because you feel like some readers are only going to see the one part and some are only going to see the other part. Like readers who are programmed to look for postmodern methods and means, that's what they'll see. And readers who really are more probably in the majority of readers who are just looking for like stories about humans in conflict with one another and suffering, they're only going to see what you think of as the modernist parts. But for me, the importance of the way I write is that those two things are living together. And just trying to in some way articulate a kind of fiction that matches my own sort of teeter-totter between like total nihilism and total belief, which in any given hour I've swung through that 100 times. So
I think like the biggest thing for me, and I think you even mentioned it we do these things at Sarah Lawrence called craft talks, in which a faculty member will give kind of a specialty talk on their writing, and you gave a craft talk when I was in school towards the end. And you even said, like, at the end of this really great craft talk, which hopefully we'll publish at some point, coming out somewhere, you were taking questions from the students, and one asked you, like, essentially, like, why you write this way or why you read who you read and why you really respond to it. You responded by saying, I have suffered. There's been a lot of pain in my life. And I felt something like I was understood by these stories. And like that was the way that I had felt, that these texts, while as nihilistic as they might seem at times, like the paragraph I'm talking about with John Hawkes, I've never felt more understood in that moment. And that's where it really resonated. And that's why that fiction matters to me. Like, that's why Cormac McCarthy, I mean, like he can write, Blood Meridian about the fucking judge just wreaking havoc on a countryside. And I feel better than had I read some like uplifting story.
Yes,
you know?
Yep. Well, I think we're probably all looking to feel seen and known when we read literature. And since we're looking to be seen when we read a book, we can, I mean, for me, it's not like I feel crazy or anything when literature doesn't reflect me back to myself. But I have trouble engaging with a lot of books that just seem, a lot of what is called literary fiction seems to me like just a better dressed version of Hollywood cliche. Like it seems like it's the same kind of like 3 acts. It's just the words are better. So like if somebody can write like, pretty descriptions, somehow they're able to be considered more literary, but they're telling the same basic lies and embracing the same systems that I think literature ought to be trying to expose and rail against. Literature should be an act of resistance. This is why I love Push the Bully so much.
Yeah.
Your no is still stronger than your yes.
From
right?
Poetics for Bullies.
Yeah, from Stanley Elkin's story, Poetics for Bullies. And I think, I told you that craft talk you mentioned, I've been trying to develop a more cohesive essay out of it that would be, to be read rather than to be spoken. And somehow the thesis has something to do with like resistance. Like what makes literature great for me has something to do with like refusing all systems, refusing the status quo. It's like the sword of Damocles or whatever that dangles over a ruler's head. You have to be willing to sit in the throne knowing that it's all going to end, and being aware of the transience both of our lives and of our whole species and all of this stuff that like just got here and will be gone before the universe can blink. And I feel like literature that is unaware somehow of our tenuous position is not reflecting me back to myself.
That's an interesting phrase, reflecting back to myself, especially in like the current literary landscape and like what we're looking at. And like, there's people really advocating for books that reflect them and their identity. Yeah. But what you're talking about is like, you could read, like, I'm thinking about like Otessa Mushfegh with McGlue. Like that is a book that I totally feel that reflecting back to me, but that has nothing to do with me and my identity.
Right.
So I think that's like a really interesting conversation, especially today.
Well, sure, because it's true right now. People seem to be retreating into smaller and smaller identity boxes, and that doesn't seem like the kind of connection we ought to be looking for. I just think the entire species is in peril, right?
Okay, well, we had a Rosetta interruption there for a minute. Well, let's talk. I mean, Anthropica is it Anthropica or Anthropica? How do you want it pronounced?
I say Anthropica because the way I would say like anthropic principle. Yeah.
Well, that's.
But I don't really care how people say it. Okay. As long as they buy it.
Well, what does Anthropica mean? Why that title?
Yeah, because
there's a subtitle too.
Yes, the subtitle is new. So the anthropic principle is this idea that, to boil it down, that like humans are the center of the universe, right? So for me, the Anthropica, which is sort of the name that Stuart Dreggs, a character in the book, actually gives to the universe. He gives to the universe because his discovery is that the whole universe is only here because humans want it to be, that human desire is all there is. So for me, it's kind of like a joke that takes a scientific theory to its extreme. Yeah.
Well, and the Anthropica theory is that like the world's resources essentially run out like every 8 days or something. Is that what he says in the book?
Yeah, I think it's 8. That has changed. It was 30, then it was 8. I can't remember. Yeah. But yeah, the idea is that Stuart has basically run the numbers, right? And he's looking at how much oil and coal and water, like how much we're consuming every day. And based on what there is on Earth, he's created this really complex software program. Based on what there is and what we're using, we exhaust all of the Earth's resources in a matter of days. And so he's asking, well, how could that be? Yeah. Right? That's not strictly speaking possible, and yet it is. And so, from there he develops this theory that it must only be here because we want it to be here. Somehow our desire for it is replenishing it.
I have been walking with you on the street before, and you have stopped me and you have said, where the fuck does all this come from, Katie?
Right,
like
all
looking
this
at power
stuff.
lines and stuff. So, like, where does that come? Have you always been that way since a kid? Like, were you overwhelmed by the world?
Oh, yeah. I remember asking my father on a drive once about like highways and how far they went, and just the idea that they're even just thinking about roads, right? Like, how on earth could we have poured this much asphalt all over the planet, right? And, the entire planet can be circled in a matter of hours in a swift flying jet. It just doesn't seem big enough to sustain the rates of consumption of
It
billions
seems
and billions of
impossible
people.
that we have enough trees to breathe.
Oh,
with.
how could there be enough trees? That's, I mean,
Yeah.
And really, how can there be enough coal that we're still burning coal, right? I mean, 7.5 billion people
Yeah.
needing stuff powered through coal consumption.
Yeah.
Like how that just even now talking about it, that seems crazy to me.
Yeah.
That could be true. So I think dregs might be onto something in the book.
You have in your press kit a really good quote that I just want to read because I used it as the very beginning because I think it, like, I don't know. I think it just puts into the book into a good light, or it just shows kind of like what you're doing and
Right.
and what we're talking about here. You say, fact, 18 million tons of coal burned globally each day. Fact, 80 million barrels of oil burned globally each day. Fact, 10 million trees shredded and pulped each day. It didn't really take 24 gigabytes of RAM or his software design prowess to verify an inconvenient truth that every thinking person had already at some point intuited. None of this shit was actually possible. Like, I love that quote. I read
Yeah.
that and I was like, I'm using that for everything.
Yeah, I
to
like
put
that too.
out.
It's fun to hear you read it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that right? Is that actually 18 million tons of coal? Is that what we burn globally?
Yeah, I think those numbers, I should, yes, but I think they might be on the modest side.
Yeah.
A couple of them, I was told when a friend read the book that he thought, based on his own quick research, that those numbers might be higher. But yeah, I'm trying to be accurate based on what I could hunt down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's also, I mean, that's kind of like the scientific part of the book that's
Yeah.
happening. So you have this like very like, I don't know, almost kind of like mathematical portion of the book.
Right.
One character is like, he has a whole thing with math, his math.
His math,
his useless
right? Finn,
math.
his
yeah.
math. Yeah, I love when people make fun of his math. Yeah.
But like really huge parts of the book are failure and desire. I mean,
Yeah.
desire is what, in Stuart Dregg's The Scientist's theory, is what's keeping the world going.
Yes,
And
right.
then so many characters are just like plagued by the great debacles and their failure.
Yes,
and
yeah,
like
yeah.
one character sounds very, very familiar. Well, a lot of them, they all do really. But
Yes, yeah.
Grace Kitchen, she's a failed writer and
Yeah.
in her eyes. So what, I guess...
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's a question at the end of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you write a lot about that, like in
Yeah.
general, and a lot of your stories, like failure comes up and desire, and
Yeah.
I guess just like why do those things drive you so much, and like are they so prevalent in your work?
Yeah, well, I think desire is prevalent in my work because, desire is suffering, and we can't kill it, and so we're always going to suffer.
Mm-hmm.
And I really do think suffering is what unites us all. And, just to go back to the conversation about like identity, right? You can bet whoever's sitting across from you is in pain. That's that's kind of a given, and I try to start conversations from there, right? It's what unites us. As far as failure goes, I think, so I published a book in 2001. And I really thought I was going to be like the next literary big thing. Like that book was published in a really big way by Random House. I was being, driven around in black town cars to readings, asked to do like TV appearances, all kinds of stuff that seemed to confirm this belief I had at the time that I was better than everyone. So it was really a nice period of ignorance and bliss. But over time, I continued to write books and no one wanted them, and they were getting weirder and darker. And so until, we're talking about like 18 years having written 5 other books that no one wanted, and just feeling like with each one, hope was harder to sort of maintain. But that's certainly not the only failure I've had in my life. There's a lot in the book about like sports, like Finn, who is the guy who does all the math, is also an ultimate frisbee player, which is a sport I have played and yes, have played. I have played at the highest level of my sport for many years. And I was just thinking about all the different ways in which I was psychologically deficient in that part of my life too. And as a result had failed in certain ways, whether or not they mattered to other people. So some of the failure stuff is personal, but the other part is I feel like most of us are probably defined at least as much by our failures as by our successes, but no one really wants to talk about that in the same way you're if you meet someone in line at the grocery store, you're not supposed to tell them that you want to die. You're supposed to tell them how nice the weather is.
Yeah.
So there's something about, I don't know, trying to use my fiction as a way to deal with some of the issues that you can't discuss in line for groceries.
Well, I'll say since we decided, since we worked out the contract, the verbal contract, and then the actual one of publishing your book, you've seemed more ecstatic about fiction writing than you have in a number of years.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's true. I would say that I probably had given... So when I finished Anthropica, there's 3, 4... When did I send it to you that time? That was like 4 years ago, a long time ago.
Yeah, after many years of me hounding you.
Yeah. So I finished it a long time ago, and I really thought this has got to be the book, right? Like I knew it was good, and then when I couldn't get anyone to buy into it, a couple editors at big houses, they liked it, but they were like, "Oh, we can never get it past our."
I'm interested in that. Why? Because the book is fucking phenomenal.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly did know that I had done something good and original. But then when no one wanted that, I did feel like, well, that's it. Like I don't have anything left in the tank. This is like a bunch of books now. And it even became harder to teach because you feel like you don't really have a platform if you're not putting books out. And so, yeah, my attitude toward fiction had become something like, well, it's this like secret hobby I engage in, like putting ships in bottles or something. Like it seemed to lose any real sense of weight in my life. And of course, I'm happily married. I have 2 kids, and they're often like the center of my life too. And so it was really easy just to, focus everything on them. They're still obviously the most important thing. But yeah, so literature and my part in it had seemed to sort of dissolve a little bit in its significance. And then when you guys said you wanted to publish the book, and it gave me the opportunity to go back and start looking at the book again, I would say that, yeah, it's true. I was sort of, my own fire was reignited, and, it's good to feel like you're a practicing artist and not just somebody trying to teach other people to be practicing artists. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so interested. I mean, this goes back to, we've had this conversation on the podcast about like why certain books don't get published. You can read a book and be like, holy fuck, this is a masterpiece, which we've had several other readers so far read it. And you're going to read a little bit today on the podcast, which is exciting for me. I could reread it, and I have now over the years several times.
You have, yes.
But like why certain books don't get published in the first place, it's I don't know.
Yeah.
Well,
it's frustrating because I see it with my students as well. Like, I've had a number of students publish books, and I've always been really happy for them. But some of the students who have written what I see as the best books have a harder time getting them published. And it's like people resist the thing that doesn't resemble the product they know the product that they know, and in this case, the product that they know they can sell because they've sold it before. And sometimes they forget that like it really, like some of the books on their list were books that were quite unusual. But yeah, so it's hard to get people to take a chance. And it's also, I mean, I don't know, in my case, all the people with the most power have told me, not in this exact way, but have indicated that there's something wrong with my work. Like there's something wrong with what I'm doing. And it makes you feel crazy, because you're reading the things that those same people in power are like applauding and, just lionizing and consider like this is the highest execution of the form. And you're like, yeah, I mean, it's okay. It's, it's certainly doing the things that novels do. Right? Sometimes it feels like everyone just wants to put the needle down on a record called Golden Oldies and like enjoy its melody. Yeah.
Well, I feel like we've talked a lot of shit here in vague terms. So maybe we should put our money where our mouths are and have you read a little bit and see what happens.
Okay.
Who knows? Maybe people will universally rise up against us now after this, and the planet will fall apart.
Well, I'm not For the record, I really don't. I don't want to everyone should love the books they love.
Sure.
Right? And the fact that a lot of people love a lot of books that I think are just okay, it doesn't mean that I'm right. It just means that I have to believe I'm not alone in the universe and that there are other people like me who are looking for the kind of book I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And I feel they are being underserved in a lot of ways by the literary community. And they're definitely out there. The thing is, there may not be as many of them.
Yeah.
Right. And so everyone is just playing the statistical game. But yeah, I like to remind myself to be careful, because it's true, we are talking a certain amount of trash, but I don't think that these books are not good.
Sure.
These books that don't speak to me, I think they're very good. That's how they get out there in the first place. It's just that I think there's a lot of other stuff that is as good or for me, better or more relevant that has a harder time getting out there.
Yeah.
I really am not trying to alienate anyone. I tell my students all the time, no one can tell you what you love, right?
But I think in general, you can say more difficult, anything with a whiff of experimental language in it is generally the hardest stuff to get out there, and that's what we're talking about. And there are writers across a broad variety of backgrounds and cultures that write this more experimental stuff and has a hard time finding a home. And
that's true.
I don't know. I have no problem talking trash
Okay,
about that.
good.
That's why we want to publish the books we want to publish.
Right, of course. Yeah, in some ways it's reactive. You're looking at what's missing and you're trying to fill the gap.
Yeah.
It's admirable.
All right, what part are you reading from?
Well, it looks like I'm going to read chapter 25.
Oh, that's helpful.
Yes. I like to say the numbers so people will know that I've worked hard. There must be 24 preceding chapters.
Great.
And there's a lot of chapters in the book, 70 or something. So this chapter 25 is a piece. So as you have intimated, there are many characters in the book. One of the characters is a man named Henry, who is suffering from ALS and is becoming slowly locked in, to use the nomenclature of his disease. The argot maybe is a better word there. Anyway, as he's becoming locked in, he's discovering that he has access in some weird way to the desires of other people. And is beginning to discover that he may even be able to control or manipulate those desires in some way. So the piece I'm about to read is the first piece in which this is starting to become manifest for him. So you won't really hear Henry's name until the end of this chapter.
Okay.
But yeah.
You read this for the very first reading too.
I think you're right,
Yeah.
And it's probably the same as it was then, although I probably made some edits for that so that it would stand alone a little bit better. Yeah. So now there's this issue where the microphone angle of the podcast is making it difficult for me to see the work, but I'll do my best.
That's okay. It sounds
All right.
good still. You can.
All right, good. Chapter 25. On the streets of Lower Manhattan, in the middle of a bright late October day whose sunshine possessed a seasonal pumpkinish quality, a yellow cab's driver was lost momentarily in an internal litany of accusations against spouse, God, and country, both the United States and the country of his birth, Pakistan, when he made an aggressive left off of Canal to raise a veritable symphony of horn-blowing from those myriad travelers forced to reluctantly uphold the social contract by tapping their brakes, an inconvenience for which no forgiveness could be brokered neither on earth nor in heaven. This left-turning Pakistani-American, swiveling his head defiantly toward those righteously indignant drivers, and offering with his right hand an obscene gesture, just as his left hand, which loosely gripped the faux leather steering wheel coverlet, felt the percussion of impact, the front bumper having met with something heavy but yielding, and then an instant later a small squeal, perhaps his own, cut through the cabin, and the woman he'd struck arrived at the terminus of his windshield, which spiderwebbed but did not give, and he thought he saw in the flash of her bewildered face a kind of knowledge of all the lesser crimes he had committed on this day and days prior, that would now be dwarfed not only by the charges of vehicular manslaughter, but also by the guilt and regret he would carry inside himself henceforth, not to mention all the blame he would harbor against the forces conspiring to ruin his entire disposition on this particular day, thereby leading to the careless left turn on which his life was apparently destined to hinge, though at this particular moment his brain was releasing a flood of endorphins into his system such that he exited the cab and knelt before her ruined body in a state of total calm, with the smell of grease and petrol hanging thick in the air and rendering the orange light heavy and woolen, such that he felt the urge to remove the light from the bloodless sack of bones that had only recently been a real live woman, and which now lay defeated within a ring of witnesses summoned by her sacrifice. The driver put both hands on his head as if breathing deep after a strenuous workout, and in his brain pit he simply wished for it not to be real. He wanted it not to have happened, and he strangely trusted that this wanting would be enough. And of course he had no idea that at that very instant in Florence, Italy, a woman and her lover had just completed their obligatory tourist climb to the top of the Duomo to look out across the twilit city whose notched ceramic roofs glowed a deep ochre, while in the distance a blue-silver river snaked through the foothills surrounding the city proper where, the woman imagined, other lives were unfolding in a kind of idyllic grace. She saw in her mind's eye acres of unruined countryside and a huge peasant table at which neighboring families drank wine made from their own grapes and laughed and touched each other lightly while a matriarch beckoned from the door of a farmhouse in the dying light. And this American tourist woman wondered if the young man beside her dreamt of such a life, while the young man, for his part, was struck anew by the woman's beauty and his good fortune, and as he held her hand there against the railing at the top of the Duomo, images of her naked body, her warmth and her smell and the feel of her small breasts in his hands flittered through him, as did the first ruined cells that would a year from now spell testicular cancer and a year after that his death. But right now these lovers hoped only that each shared the other's private longings, and neither of them could imagine that any force on earth could supersede their wanting, despite the fact that they did not know the shape of the universe, nor the fact that at that very same moment an Alaskan wildfire fighter, what they call a smoke jumper, was furiously digging line a mile beyond the hot zone when his radio crackled and a superior's voice informed him of a sudden bizarre shift in wind speed and bearing that was almost as unprecedented as the fire itself was at this time of year in this region. And yet here he was digging through the still soft soil of an arid pine forest 15 miles outside Anchorage suburbs, with eagles soaring above not in their usual capacity as alpha predators, but as an army retreating in the same direction that he was now informed to retreat, because the blaze was bearing down on him, and what was his current position exactly, and could he huff it over to the ravine on Jockey's Edge, because this was a total shitstorm and the air cover was still 40 miles north. Do you copy over? But he could already hear the monster screaming toward him and casting its hot tentacles of flame out over the tree line, and although he had, of course, always known that his work was a little bit crazy, still, he'd never once considered this no-win scenario. He didn't know a single man who'd died fighting fire, and even had he considered the possibility of his own death, and now the flames were ripping through the old growth, so that staring off into the middle distance he had the impression that the forest had been torn open to reveal an inferno that it had always hidden, and that backlit the veil of earth and sky. Well, even then, he would not have envisioned doing what he did next, which was not to make his own wingless flight toward a ravine unlikely to save him from the juggernaut whose heat was of an order that no earthly heat approximated. In fact, he could already feel that his blood was hotter. What it felt like was like he was also the fire. No, he did not flee, but only dropped his shovel in the dirt and kneeled in the loam and began praying for his little girl Wendy, now 5 years old, praying for her to live a good and happy life. He closed his eyes and felt the hair on his forearms singe, and he did not know it, but he was repeating the words, "Jesus Christ, have mercy on her soul." He thought of the little girl's smile and the way she sort of glowed with white light. Emanating her own private energy signature, he prayed that she would be spared pain, and that wherever he was now going, the energy signature would be there, too. He wanted the part of himself that was her to go on forever. He wanted it with an intensity that could drive turbines, and as he waited to know what it would feel like when he left this earthly tangle of suffering and need, he did not know. Of course not. How could he know? that right then in a ranch-style 3-bedroom situated in the dry red dust and clay of a desert suburb sprung up, i.e. the suburb, some 2 decades earlier on the outskirts of Tempe, Arizona, a 15-year-old boy was on the internet ogling with an intensity akin to worship, short videos of young and largely interchangeable men engaging in a grisly assortment of sex acts, their hairless bodies contorted into positions completely useless for anything but these highly specific micro-activities, the boy whispering derisive evaluations into the close-smelling air of his bedroom. Disgusting. Gross. Ugh. As he leaned into the screen and imagined their hands on his bare chest, their mouths on his thighs, his closed window shade glazed like a deep-fried donut by an early afternoon sun that even in October seemed intent on vitrifying the entirety of this bone-dry state of the Union, made temporarily habitable by 100,000 air conditioners humming off-key and without cessation, the boy's housing grid vibrating with electrical current derived from unthinkably enormous coal-fired generators somewhere out in the middle of this endless fucking desert. And even the boy knew, in the reptilian part of his brain, that it would require near infinite quantities of coal to sustain this paradigm, and that it simply was not possible if considered rationally as a kind of problematic. And the boy imagined what might be said or done to those daring to come out in the conservative precincts of Tempe. He imagined Todd Barone, football-playing meathead and gleeful torturer of the meek, following him home after school, forcing his way into this very home and doing very, very bad things to the boy and his family. He imagined the word fag carved into his chest with a razor blade. He imagined, for some reason, crosses burning on his front lawn, which lawn was the same patch of dead straw that cinctured each identical half-acre property as far as the eye could see. He imagined, "I'd like to suck dick," scrawled in black Sharpie on his locker, and worse things, things involving animal blood, things involving matches. But he wasn't gay. He couldn't be. And he watched the naked men aglow on his computer screen, and he touched his erection with a desperate, hollow feeling in his chest, and he thought of a shy boy in his class named Liam. He imagined Liam's palms on his naked back, and he felt himself filled to bursting like a cloth bladder with a fluid called desire. And he said it aloud, "Gross, I'm not gay." And then his 15-year-old body convulsed with its latest orgasm. The warm ejaculate shot from the fist that clutched the erection and onto the boy's bare stomach, and then he was quietly crying, there in the middle of his room, in the middle of an untenable desert, crying with a shame that threatened to set him ablaze and burn the entire suburb to ashes. But he could not know. Not one of them could know that in a high-ceilinged room, whose skylight looked myopically upward toward a heartless blue sky, a wheelchair-bound former professor whose suicide had been diverted by a Hungarian madman or visionary intent on eradicating the human species, sat motionless while a dozen simpletons dressed as spermatozoa danced around him in clumsy arcs as if in celebration of his disease. The man's breath fed to him through nasal tubes, his body a locked box into which his mind receded deeper every day as if sucked inward toward some cosmic singularity. This man named Henry wondering what these visions of the cab driver, of the young woman atop the Duomo, of the man beside her filled with longing and gratitude, of the smoke jumper awaiting his demise, of the crying boy unwilling to accept his queerness and doomed to a double life of denial and pursuit, what these visions were. For they arrived within the locked box with great clarity and dimension, and they seemed to have something important to tell him. In the same way that his dream of dragging a hefty bag filled with the parts of a man he'd killed through dark city alleyways had something important to tell him. In the same way that the other increasingly acute vision of enormous bipedal robots calling out chess moves into a dim-lit and empty hangar had something important to tell him. And there were more visions, too, some more easily accounted for than others. He had visions of his own healthy young body, visions of his ex-wife's nakedness beneath him, visions of hundreds of dead passengers on a commuter train that threaded through a strange and isolated city surrounded by great marshy fields of rice. He was a dying man, but he felt so alive. He tried to beckon the Hungarian over to his side. He nodded his head spasmodically. He blinked. He twitched an index finger. He, Henry, had become something. The world quivered with desire, and he absorbed it into his own. He was nearly locked in. He was a bomb casing. He was the weapons-grade plutonium of wanting. He was not dead yet, and he was no longer sure he ever would be.
Man, I forgot we were even recording the podcast for a minute. I just got sucked into that.
Yeah. Well,
Oh,
thank you.
so
Yeah, I
good.
forgot. I forgot too where we were and what we were doing.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would like you to read to me always. You
Yeah.
do have such a good reading
That's
voice.
what you think. You'd get bored pretty quickly.
Well, and what our listeners do not get to see is that you make a lot of gestures when you read as well.
Yeah, it was funny. I realized at some point when I was just reading that passage that I was doing that and that there was no need to. There was no audience. But somehow that's, it's almost reflexive at this point. It helps me. It helps me be in the reading.
Well, it's about an hour, and so I could sit here probably all day and keep talking to you. But
No, I guess it's time, yeah.
We have to do the things that are meaningless, but that we must do.
Yes.
It's very important that we do them.
That is the title of my craft talk.
What is it exactly?
Everything you do is completely meaningless, but it is very important that you do it. Yeah.
I feel like that's the title of this podcast.
Yes,
now.
yes.
This
Let's
episode.
use that for everything we can. I believe Gandhi said that, but there's a sentiment like it in the Bhagavad Gita, which is where I thought I was stealing it from, but I think it's actually Gandhi.
Well, thanks, David, for being
Thanks,
on
Katie.
today.
This was
Yeah.
really fun. I hope I didn't talk too much.
That's the point of this.
Yeah.
But we'll have you back. There's so much more we didn't even begin
Yeah,
to talk about.
That's
And,
true. You know, I
yeah.
always have this feeling when I'm talking about talking about anything, my writing or my life or anything else, that I'm just kind of making it up. And that if you were to ask me the same set of questions tomorrow, I'd give a completely different set of answers. And I wish it was a different way, but there always is something about it that feels a little made up.
Well, we'll have you back on and figure out if
Yeah, and
you
then we'll
think
compare.
we'll compare the
We'll
podcast.
compare. Yes. In fact, you could just do it like as somebody accusing a suspect. You know,
You
on
know,
December 20th, 2019, you said the following.
as just like a little aside going out. So whenever a faculty member gives a craft talk, there's always a student that introduces them. And I wanted to introduce you obviously that
Right,
year, but
yeah.
somebody else had beat me to it. I won't name them.
Yes, I know who it was.
Yeah, which their introduction was fine. But I wrote one that at one point when I introduce you for a reading, I'm going to read. But it essentially has to deal with as if you are on trial and I am your lawyer, appealing to the council people, and your work you're about to read is the evidence.
That sounds
Both
fantastic.
for you and against
Yes,
you.
Yeah, I have a story. I know we have to go, but I have a story called "A Good Human," which is framed as that's a great story actually. That's a story about a human who has ascended to non-sentience after like working at a toaster factory for a certain number of years. But yeah, he's on trial because his non-sentience is a crime. Yeah, so
Well, that's for another. We
Yes,
haven't even
yeah.
touched on robots or
that's true.
anything
so
today.
much more to talk about.
Yeah,
but,
the next one.
This was really fun.
All right.
Okay, that's it for today's episode. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and review on whichever platform you're listening. You can get in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Animal Riot Press or through our website, animalriotpress.com. This has been the 44th episode of the Animal Riot podcast with me, your host, Katie Rainey, and featuring the one and only David John Hollander. Our transcripts for our deaf and hard of hearing animals are provided by Jonathan Kay. This episode was cut by our podcast assistant, Dylan Thomas, and we are produced by me, Katie Rainey. See you later, you filthy animals.
Click, word, yes sir, it's the burn. Bombing on your lane, getting gully as a fern. I don't know much about